Welcome everyone to this week's webinar. I'm Amy Clausen here at the Niagara-on-the-Lake Museum, and today we have John Henry with us, who's joining us all the way from New York City. He would have been here visiting for a live lecture and had planned a trip. Unfortunately, we couldn't do that. But John will be presenting the Cayuga and Her Consorts, Remembering Those Beloved Niagara-to-Toronto Steamers. And this is another presentation in our All Along the Waterfront series, which is sponsored by Jeff and Lorraine Joyner. So John Henry was a journalist in New York for more than 4 decades. He wrote for the Associated Press, Newsday, and the New York Daily News. He's also been published in the quarterly journals of the Steamship Historical Society of America and the Great Lakes History. And we have a couple of these books called Great White Fleet, which are by John Henry, published by Dundurn Press. So he's going to talk about all of his research and all the steamships. I'm going to be monitoring the Q&A box and the chat box at the bottom of the screen. So if you have any questions for John during the presentation, feel free to type them in there, and then I will field them to him at the end of the presentation. So I will turn it over to you, John, and I will sign off for a bit.
Thank you very much, Amy. I'm delighted to be able to talk to you today about one of my favorite subjects, the wonderful ships that used to steamers that used to operate between the Niagara River and Toronto. I just wish I'd been able to give my talk in Niagara-on-the-Lake, a place that I've been returning to regularly ever since I was a child in the 1950s. And one of the reasons I like to return is that it once had steamer service. And I know what an integral role that played in the daily summer life of the town and helped to shape its charming character. As Barlow Cumberland wrote in his fine book, A Century of Sail and Steam on the Niagara River, the advent of the daily steamer is a crowning jewel, bringing all the neighborhood down to the waterside dock in curiosity or in welcome. I developed a passion for steamer travel on the Great Lakes when I was growing up in Buffalo in the early post-war years. And at that time, you could take a large steamer overnight across Lake Erie from Buffalo to Detroit. I begged my parents to take me aboard one of these vessels, and take me they did. By the time the service ended in 1950, I had been aboard one of these ships no fewer than 4 times in 5 years, and I was hooked. So given these treasured experiences, it was inevitable that I would become an avid fan of the largest passenger fleet of them all, and that was the one operated on the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence River by Canada Steamship Lines of Montreal. This was a fleet so big, a passenger fleet so big, that one maritime historian called it a passenger ship empire. This map, published in a 1948 Canada Steamship Lines brochure, shows the vast extent of that empire. It ranged all the way from Duluth, Minnesota, at the western end of Lake Superior, up there in the upper left-hand corner, to the lower St. Lawrence, well beyond Quebec City. And at the time, the Niagara-Toronto service was just one component of a superb interconnected operation that enabled you to travel over the course of 4 days and 3 nights from Queenston and Niagara-on-the-Lake to the magnificent fjord-like Saguenay River, which is a tributary of the St. Lawrence northeast of Quebec City. At the point where the 2 rivers converge, the St. Lawrence is actually no longer a river, but a broad saltwater estuary. So Canada Steamship Lines could plausibly advertise this entire 700-mile trip with the tantalizing slogan, Niagara to the sea. Let's look at how this system would work if you lived in Niagara. Here's a picture of the SS Cayuga. By the way, that was the ship that opened the slideshow shown at the foot of Melville Street early in her career. You'd take the Cayuga, shown here, leaving the Niagara River, heading out into Lake Ontario for a 2-hour trip to Toronto. And there, you'd quickly transfer to this ship called the Kingston, which would make an overnight trip from Toronto through the Thousand Islands to Prescott, Ontario, on the St. Lawrence, which is as far as ships of this size could proceed before the St. Lawrence Seaway opened in 1959. And at Prescott, you'd transfer to another Canada Steamship Line steamer, the Rapids Prince. She was specially designed to run the rapids of the St. Lawrence, which all other ships bypassed using a series of small locks that predated the St. Lawrence Seaway. This was a 9.5-hour all daylight trip to Montreal. And probably the most exciting stretch was one in which the ship descended 56 feet in a space of less than 2 miles. When you reached Montreal, you'd take one of these ships for the final leg of the trip. And it's a measure of just how big this passenger ship empire was, that these 4 vessels, when this photograph was taken in 1928, represented less than 1/6 of the company's total passenger fleet. And the reason they're all bunched together, I presume it's at the beginning of the season. So you take one of these vessels overnight to Quebec City, and then go further down the St. Lawrence with an exquisite daylight run to the Saguenay River. And you're seeing here one of the 2 most notable topographical features of the river, and that's one of the capes that towers more than 1,400 feet above the water, and led the company to promote it as higher than Gibraltar. But today, let's focus just on the Niagara part of Niagara to the sea. The service that Canada Steamship Lines operated from its inception in 1913 until 1951, when the last of the ships on the route, the fondly remembered Cayuga, was retired from service. It would operate, however, later in the 1950s for another company, and I'll talk about that later in my presentation. The Cayuga and the 3 sister ships that entered the Canada Steamship Lines fleet were either acquired by or built for the Niagara Navigation Company. This was an enterprise founded by Toronto investors in 1877 to tap the burgeoning excursion trade between Toronto, Niagara Falls, and Buffalo. And the company could count on the charming half-hour trip up the river from Niagara to Queenston and back. I mean, the total trip would have taken an hour. And as Barlow Cumberland, the man whom I mentioned at the beginning, he happened to be a co-founder of Niagara Navigation. And he wrote this: "It was found very early on that the trip up the river is the main attraction of the route, giving as it does scenery unusual and without compare, a respite from the open lake, and allowing a stroll on shore, either at Niagara or Lewiston, while awaiting the return journey." The company promoted its service ambitiously in both the United States and Canada. And according to Cumberland, it was instrumental in getting employers in Toronto to let their workforce off early at 1 p.m. on Saturday afternoons. So they could do things like, guess what? Take an excursion steamer from Toronto to Niagara. The movement slogan was, Saturday afternoons are for recreation, Sundays are for rest. The company was so successful that by the time these ships entered the Canada Steamship Line's fleet in 1913, on peak summer days, they were carrying up to 25,000 passengers, which isn't surprising when you consider that there were 6 sailings daily in each direction, at least at the height of summer. And one of the things that Niagara Navigation did well was to establish a very close working relationship with the railroads that led from Buffalo down to the 3 ports on the Niagara River, Queenston, Niagara-on-the-Lake, and Lewiston, New York, which was a port of call until the late 1930s. The most exciting of these rail trips, easily, were the 2 trains. These were electric interurban trains that ran from Buffalo, one on the American side of the Niagara Gorge, were operated by the Niagara Gorge Railway, and the other by the International Railway, which linked Buffalo and Queenston. And this is the kind of views that people who rode those interurban cars would get. This is on the American side of the Niagara Gorge, and the little train is headed north. You can gauge the popularity of these interurban rail cars by the fact that you can count about 10 of them on the dock at Queenston in this photograph taken around 1900. And they needed a lot of cars because a ship like this, the SS Chippewa, would disgorge 2,000 passengers at a time. But meanwhile, the Michigan Central Railroad operated as many as 5 trains a day during the summer, right down to the dock at Niagara-on-the-Lake. You see here a steamer coming in from Toronto with the red rail coaches over on the right. And that rail service right down to the dock had a side benefit that in inclement weather, the locomotives would be brought into position to shine their headlights so that the ships, to guide the ships into the river. And they would also blow their whistles, that is the locomotives. This is before the government had installed range lights at the mouth of the Niagara River. The first ship in the fleet was easily had the most distinctive history. She was the Chikora, and she was built in 1864 in England as a fast blockade runner for the Confederacy during the Civil War, which would last only another year. So somebody bought her and brought her to the Upper Lakes, where she became a passenger steamer and continued in that role for a few years, and then also carried troops during the Red River Rebellion in what is now Manitoba. Later in the 1870s, the Governor General Lord Dufferin and his wife used the ship as a yacht. Niagara Navigation Company acquired her in 1877 and put her into service the next year. And Barlow Cumberland, the co-founder of the company, was definitely pleased. No finer steamer was there on the Upper Lakes than the Chikora, whether American or Canadian. It could approach her in speed. And that experience, that design to run a blockade really helped her. She could go 19 miles an hour, which was very fast for that time. You'll notice the white foam under the name Chikora that would indicate that she is a side wheeler with, that is, paddle wheels on the side. And this would be the method of propulsion for the first 4 ships in the fleet. The next, this is a picture in the Victorian era. I wonder how long those women in white would stay with those pristine dresses with coal smoke raining down on them. Steamer travel wasn't all pleasant. Um, the next steamer in the fleet was the Cibola, which came out in 1888. And she had an uneventful career until 1895, when she was tied up for the night at Lewiston. A fire broke out and burned down to the main deck, trapping an engineer who was on board. The ship broke free of her moorings and floated with the current down the Niagara to near Youngstown, and it was taken in hand, and it was determined that she was beyond repair. The next vessel in the fleet was the Chippewa, which was built in Hamilton, came out in 1893, and it was designed by the man who is regarded as the premier naval architect of his time of lake and river steamers in North America. And that was Frank E. Kirby of Detroit, who also happened to design those wonderful steamers I traveled aboard as a child between Buffalo and Detroit, and also between New York City and Albany on the Hudson River. The ship could carry 2,100 passengers, and this picture taken early in her career looks as though all 2,100 were on deck there. The company augmented its fleet with another vessel in 1897. And she was the Corona, which was designed by the man who was considered second only to Kirby as a designer of lake and river passenger steamers. And that was a Swedish-born man who practiced his trade in Toronto, named Arent Engström. And this ship, everything was new about this ship, except for the engines, which had been salvaged from the burned out Cibola. And with the augmentation of this vessel into the fleet, the company could once again offer 6 sailings in each direction, something that would continue right up through the late 1920s. It would be another 10 years before the company added its final vessel, the Cayuga, which was the first propeller-driven ship in the fleet and was also the fastest. It could go 22.5 miles an hour. And it could carry 2,500 people, a few more than the Chippewa. Like the Corona, she was designed by Arent Engström, and I think this is one of his finest products. I think it's particularly graceful because of the nice rake of those 2 smokestacks, the equally nice rake of the 2 masts, and then a subtle dip in the ship's profile amidships, what naval architects call shear, that is the longitudinal curvature of the hull between bow and stern. And then there was the ship's pilot house, which the Toronto Marine historian praised for its tall sectioned windows, its 2 bridge wings, the open bridge above the pilot house, and the tasteful wood and canvas name board. The interior of the ship was pretty impressive also, when you consider this was a ship on which passengers in each direction would spend at maximum 3 hours. And this is the room that extended the full width of the ship, known as the General Saloon. Yes, saloon, not salon. And you're looking at it longitudinally, probably from stern to bow. And it was thoughtfully fitted with bay windows so that passengers can see ahead and astern as well as straight out. The bays were designed to keep so that small groups could keep together. And two of the bays were finished as private parlors, one on each side, for passengers who wanted to be left alone. These ships actually had two owners before they went into the Canada Steamship Line's fleet. First, there was Niagara Navigation, and then for a very brief period, 1 year in the lead up to the formation of Canada Steamship Lines, there was the Richelieu and Ontario Navigation Company, which took over the ships. But this was a long-established Montreal-based operator of passenger ships on Lake Ontario and the St. Lawrence River. At first, the changes in ownership didn't affect the outward appearance of the ships. They had this color scheme right up into the years of Canada Steamship Line's ownership. Notice the black paint halfway up the main deck and two crimson funnels with black bands. But then in the 1920s, Canada Steamship Lines went to what I consider the best color scheme for the vessels. They were painted all white. This is the Cayuga going downriver in that period. And the company topped them off with probably the best smokestack colors I've seen on the Great Lakes, this wonderful shade of orange, red, white, and black. And those colors would remain with one modification. In the 1930s, the hulls were painted an attractive shade of dark green. I inherited an affection for the Cayuga from my parents, who often spoke fondly of her. They took her in 1930 as they were on their honeymoon, headed for Toronto. And they would celebrate their anniversary almost every year by taking her for the next 2 decades. My one and only, unfortunately only, trip aboard the Cayuga was with them in 1954 when I was age 14. And we approached the dock at Queenston after coming down a long and winding road. And this picture was taken in the 1930s, but the scene looked much the same when we arrived there. And I would agree with Barlow Cumberland that the trip on the river was the main attraction. It was really great looking at the verdant shoreline and stately homes along the banks. But there was another highlight, and that was the approach to Toronto. This is a photograph taken about the time that I took the trip, 1954, and almost dead ahead of the ship is the building that was then the tallest tower in the British Commonwealth, the headquarters for what was then known as the Canadian Bank of Commerce. And over on the far left is the bulk of the Royal York Hotel. Well, that was then. What a difference 6 decades make. But I wasn't the only youth drawn to the Cayuga. And you realize that when you look at the responses that a woman named Carol Lidgold received when she asked readers of the Toronto Star to tell about their experiences aboard the Cayuga. And based on the information that she received from the readers, she produced 2 books in the mid-1990s, and one of them titled Cayuga, Ontario's Love Boat. And one man who painted a wonderful word picture of his boyhood visit to a lower deck of the Cayuga, where my eyes just managed to peer over the top of an iron railing stretched across a wide doorway, watching huge arms of brass and steel rise and fall in the noise and hissing of the engine room, driving the propellers that pushed us to our destination. Another man remembered that the first thing he did when he went on the Cayuga was to head right for the bow. And standing here with the Union Jack overhead, snapping in the breeze, I looked straight down. My eyes were fixed and mesmerized by the point of the stem of the bow, cutting clean and smooth through the water. The man who wrote that is Jim Smith, a lifelong Niagara resident who, like many people when he was a kid, took advantage of the steamship company's offer of a free round trip between Niagara and Queenston at the beginning of each season. And from that experience, he decided to build two models which grace the reception area of the Niagara Historical Society. Here's Jim in a picture alongside the Cayuga taken this year. And here he is admiring his handiwork some years ago of the Chippewa, a very fine model indeed. I'm indebted to Jim for the many slides he produced for my talk. Many passengers boarded the Cayuga in Toronto as part of church outings who would take a picnic to the park at Queenston Heights. And from that perch, they could look down on the ship that had just brought them there and would soon return them to Toronto. When they reboarded the ship, they were in for an exciting maneuver. Here's what Barlow Cumberland wrote. The steamer, on leaving the dock, moves further up the river, keeping in the eddy which runs along the shore by the foot of Queenston Heights. When close under the heights, the steamer turns quickly outwards towards the center of the river, and the engines are stopped. Forging slowly ahead, the bow enters into the whitened boilings and swirls of the surging currents of the rapids pouring out from the Niagara Gorge. The bow is caught by the current, and the steamer then rapidly spun around by its swiftness. Just as soon as the bow heads down the river, the engines are at once sent ahead again, and the steamer sweeps at an express train rate past the jutting points of shore. Here, a picture taken from Queenston Heights. I think the ship has just finished its express train segment and is headed downriver to pick up passengers at Niagara-on-the-Lake. I included this picture because while it shows the Chippewa sometime in the 1930s, sailing just from Lewiston over to Queenston, it gives you an idea of the dramatic view you would have of the bottom of the Niagara Gorge as either when you left Queenston or Lewiston, and could look from the deck of your ship. That black horizontal line above the ship is the old suspension bridge between Lewiston and Queenston that was in service until the early 1960s. Some of the fondest memories of the Cayuga are carried by passengers who took her for moonlight cruises, I think generally out of Toronto. This picture is taken around 1947. And these couples would dance into the wee hours to the music of a 3 or 4 person band performed on the top deck in a space that was covered but open on the sides. As Lidgold writes, there they pledged their love. And this is why she dubbed the ship Ontario's Love Boat. She also writes that the Cayuga was more than transportation. She was an adventure close to home and affordable for most people. How affordable? Back in 1918, you could make a round trip between Toronto and Niagara for $2.40. By 1957, the price had gone up only by $1.50 to $3.90, which is truly remarkable in that, considering the inflation over that period. And the fares were clearly calculated to appeal to ordinary folks. but the ships carried some notables too, including members of the British royal family and government dignitaries. Here is a picture of the Duke and Duchess of York, later King George V and Queen Mary, boarding the Corona in 1901. They were using the ship as their private yacht that day. They would travel to Queenston and then head up by land to Niagara Falls and return the same day to Niagara. Then in 1927, the Prince of Wales, later King Edward VIII, took the Cayuga, and the following year, Ramsay MacDonald, who was twice British Prime Minister, sailed aboard the Chippewa. Of course, the comings and goings of the ship were a welcome fixture of summer life in the town. Here's the Cayuga coming in from Lake Ontario into the river. And when the ship was coming in, young swimmers would grab their inner tubes and delightedly ride the waves created by the ship off of Mississauga Point and Queens Royal Beach. The ship sent out waves like the ocean, and Byers recalled in an oral history with the Niagara Historical Society back in 2004. A daily ritual down at the dock was boys diving for coins. Dive for coins, fill their mouths, and keep diving until their mouths were filled with silver. And the dock was also where every summer soldiers in the Army Reserve would disembark from the ship from Toronto for 2 weeks of summer training at Camp Niagara. And they'd walk, they'd march the approximately 2 miles to the camp. As Jim Smith recalls, this was a big event in town, and everyone came out to hear the pipes and drums of each regiment. And then there's this poignant scene, almost undoubtedly taken during World War I, where friends and relatives are bidding farewell to troops headed for the front. So quite a bit of history was made right on that dock. And if you came to the dock at either Queenston or Niagara in late August or September, you'd likely to find racks of peaches being loaded onto the ships, as you see here at Queenston aboard the Chippewa. And here's the same, somewhat the same scene about to transpire at Niagara-on-the-Lake. This is a picture from 1908. At one point, Canada Steamship Lines was thinking of adding a new ship to the Niagara route. The president at the time, Joseph Norcross, thought the company should build a ship that would carry 4,000 passengers, nearly double what the Cayuga and the Chippewa did. And but the board meeting minutes don't indicate why the ship was an aborted project, but they do show that by 1923, just 3 years later, the Niagara service was the least profitable of Canada Steamship Lines' 5 passenger divisions. And perhaps not coincidentally, Norcross was out as president of the company. But if the company didn't build a new ship, it did add a couple of important shore installations. Here we see the new terminal at Lewiston, which came on stream in 1926. And then the next year, the Prince of Wales, on his tour of Canada, opened a 7.5-acre passenger and freight terminal for Canada Steamship Lines along the Toronto waterfront between Bay and Yonge Streets. Amy, is this coming through? Amy?
Yeah, everything's good.
Oh, okay, good. Sadly, this new pier was underutilized as first one passenger ship and then another was retired from service. The first to go was the Corona, which was withdrawn at the end of the 1929 season. And that left just the Chippewa and the Cayuga, shown here passing one another in the 1930s on the Niagara River. But then the Chippewa was retired at the end of the 1936 season. And then there was an ice jam, a very serious one, in January 1938, which completely wrecked the 12-year-old terminal at Lewiston, and it was never rebuilt. Equally damaged, perhaps even more damaged, was the terminal over at Queenston in the same ice jam, but it was rebuilt. And undoubtedly, the Great Depression contributed greatly to the decision of Canada Steamship Lines to downsize its passenger fleet. But there was also the growing popularity of automobile travel. And this popularity had been growing for a long time. As a writer in the Globe and Mail once observed, the traveler's love affair with Great Lakes passenger steamers began to fade when the first automobiles sputtered down the first paved highway in Ontario between Toronto and Hamilton in 1912. Picture there of Middle Road between Toronto and Hamilton in 1917. Slightly different from today's QEW. Well, the love affair, the burgeoning love affair of Canadians and Americans with their cars helped to explain why a rail service completely disappeared to the three Niagara River ports. The first to go was the Michigan Central service between Buffalo and Niagara-on-the-Lake, which ended in 1925. Then in 1932, the interurban service from Buffalo to Queenston, operated by the International Railway Company, ended. It was replaced by a bus service, but that operated only between Niagara Falls and Queenston. And the Niagara Gorge Railway from Buffalo to Lewiston never reopened after a rock slide damaged the rail line in 1935. The Cayuga would have been probably doomed much earlier had it not been for the end of World War II. Because of gas rationing, people planning vacations left their car in the driveway and took a steamer instead. The result was this. During the Second World War, the Cayuga made more money than CSL, Canada Steamship, than any other ship the company owned. That's from a corporate history by Andrew Collard. And the stellar performance of the ship during the war prompted the company to invest in modernization of it after the war. And these improvements included installing new boilers that were fitted for burning oil rather than the dirtier coal that the Cayuga had always burned. But these improvements failed to yield a return on their company's investment. And not only were passenger loadings disappointing, but then there was the expensive safety equipment that had to be installed to comply with new government regulations after the horrific fire aboard one of Canada's steamship lines' Upper Lakes passenger steamers, the Niagara in 1949, which killed 118 passengers who were spending the night on the ship when she was berthed in Toronto. She was on a post-season cruise. And the Niagara fire dealt another blow to the Cayuga because there was the 48-year-old Kingston, the ship that operated from Toronto through the Thousand Islands. And the company felt it just could not rationalize an investment in this new fire safety equipment. considering the ship's age. And here she is being towed to the scrapyard in Hamilton in 1950. With her withdrawal, there was no ship to feed passengers to the Rapids steamer, the Rapids Prince. And so that service was also terminated, severing at a single stroke 2 of the 4 links in Canada Steamship Line's vaunted Niagara-to-the-Sea system, and also depriving the Cayuga of one of its traditional sources of passengers, those who wanted to make the entire trip between the Niagara River and the Saguenay River. Well, given this bleak backdrop, business backdrop, Canada Steamship Lines decided to retire the Cayuga at the end of the 1951 season, feeling it would never turn a profit. Here's how the Toronto Telegram newspaper headlined that development. But the victim of fierce competition from automobile travel was to get a reprieve because in 1953, a group of Toronto small investors led by a lifelong steamboat lover, Alan Howard, came forward to purchase the docks at Queenston and Niagara and the Cayuga herself for $100,000. And they restored the ship to its old run the next summer. Here's what she looked like, shown leaving Toronto Harbor, heading out into Lake Ontario. And the only noticeable changes are the dark green hull had given way to black, and the wonderful red, white, and black smokestacks had been repainted in a less exuberant buff, silver, and black. But she was still instantly recognizable as the graceful Cayuga. And the return of the ship on June 4th, 1954, after a 3-year absence, was greeted with fanfare, both in Toronto and here at Niagara, where you see bagpipers awaiting the arrival of the ship. And the first season got off, went fairly well. But as the Toronto marine historian Jay Bascom wrote, her new owners might well have shied away from the entire project had they known what lay in store for them. Because steamboat inspectors, ever mindful of the Noronha tragedy, visited the ship very frequently and invariably found defects that had to be corrected, draining the owners of never very plentiful financial resources. And all the while, the public's infatuation with cars was continuing to grow, and the highways on which to drive them were getting ever better. So the new enterprise, known as Cayuga Steamship Company Limited, was struggling in an increasingly inhospitable business environment. And when the Cayuga pulled into Toronto's Pier 9 on September 9th, or September 3rd, 1957, concluding yet another money-losing season, she never sailed again and was scrapped 4 years later in this sad scene. But I prefer to remember the Cayuga this way, and I think you do too. And I hope you enjoyed this trip back through time. And now I'd be happy to answer questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, John. So we do have a few questions here. Yeah. The first, and feel free everyone to type your questions in the Q&A box if you have more. Judy wanted to know what the things were that look like oars along the sides of the ship.
Oh, those are fenders, and their purpose is to protect the side of the ship when it's docking. These ships would dock unassisted alongside a pier, which can be a tricky maneuver. So that's what those wooden rectangles are, dragging the water.
Great. And two more questions that are kind of almost the same question. How did the steamships get their names? Is there a reason why they all began with C?
Yeah, um, they all begin with C and they all end in A, and three of them are of Indian origin. The Corona was not, but Barlow Cumberland liked short names when the ships were paddle steamers, so that they could comfortably be painted over the paddle box. Like Chikora is what, about I don't know, 6 letters or something like that. And Cayuga takes its name, I guess, both for a number of reasons. There's Lake Cayuga in New York State. There's Cayuga in Ontario, Cayuga Indian tribe. So I hope that answers the question.
Great. And I think that's it for questions. If people have other questions after the fact, feel free to send them along to the museum, and we can forward them to John and get some answers for you. So thank you very much, John. The book that he mentioned, Great White Fleet, that is one of his books. We do have a couple available for sale, John. It's out of print now, but John did send some, and I've already sold 2 of the 4 he sent, but there's 2 left, so it's kind of first come, first serve. Oh, I think we might have one more question. Yeah, one more question. Can you ever envision passenger services coming back to the lakes like they have in Europe rivers?
Well, certainly it would be a lot pleasanter way to travel between Toronto and Niagara than using the QEW. But the transportation infrastructure is so deeply entrenched in an auto base that it's hard to visualize something really making a profit. I know there were a couple of false starts over the years with smaller vessels, but they wouldn't have had the appeal, I think, that these vessels did, which were really beautifully finished vessels with lots of deck space on which to roam. So I wish there could be a revival, but I'm not too optimistic about it.
Well, thank you very much. Next week is our last weekly presentation online, but don't worry, we'll be doing some other virtual programming that we have in the works for the fall, so watch out for that. So on Thursday, August 27th at 4 p.m., Scott Finley from Parks Canada is going to be joining us to present 10 things that will save your life in the trenches. So we hope to see you online next week, and I hope everyone has a great day. Thanks again, John. We'll see you soon.
Bye-bye.